Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Wednesday, September the 20th, 2023. 1 day left in official summer. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to do an update, as we have been trying to do on a daily basis here when the show has been on, of the Freedom Convoy Trial. But on the subject of protests, the bigger story today is the 1 million-person protest that has gone on right across Canada from one coast to the other coast. I know we have 3 coasts in Canada, but I don't know that there was actually any protesting in the far north. But certainly on the west coast, in middle Canada and central Canada, in the prairies, right into Atlantic Canada and into the Maritimes, protests across the country in the thousands and tens of thousands. And these protests were being held by concerned citizens, parents, and other citizens who are worried about the sexualization, the increasing sexualization of their children in public schools. Particularly, what has started this has been the transgender story times, drag stories, I think they call them, that have been going on in certain elementary schools. And then there's the whole pride thing where school boards and individual schools have been enticed to fly the gay pride flag, the rainbow flag, on such and such a day or such and such a week or such and such a month in recognition of Gay Pride Month, which, if you're following, it started off as a day, then it was a week, then it was a month. Now we're talking about Gay Pride Festival, Gay Pride season. And everybody's jumping on this bandwagon. And now, of course, is this a battle where parents have basically drawn the line, where governments now are saying, okay, you know what, this trans stuff at schools, transgenderism, gender fluidity, not just the idea of teaching it, but also embracing it, indulging it with young children, okay? We're not talking about older teenagers who are about to graduate high school. We're talking about kids under 16 years old. And I know 16 is not really that young, but we don't give driver's licenses out to kids who are under 16 years old. There are lots of things that you cannot do if you're under 18 years old, let alone 16 years old. And the controversy, as you know, has been around governments now who are cracking down and saying, you know what, if the kids under 16 years old want to use a different pronoun, they want to be quote unquote transitioning, etc., that schools have to talk this through with the parents. It's not so much getting parental permission, it's consulting with parents. And, okay, ultimately, sure, the effect is, the practical aspect of this is that at some point in time, it does come down to parental permission. But it's not a question of getting permission as much as it is getting some sort of a dialogue going, some sort of input, some sort of consultation going that is in the best interest of the children. Now, what is in the best interest of the children? I've said this before, I'll say it again. I don't actually see this as a question of parental rights. I think that when it comes to children, parents have obligations, not rights. They delegate the obligation to care for the kids and to educate your children, because that's a parental obligation as well. That's a delegated thing. It's not something that exists independent of the parents at the school boards in schools. Parents delegate teachers to educate their children. And it's incumbent on the teachers, as the people to whom this responsibility is delegated, to honor the wishes of parents. But this is not so much a parental rights thing. I know a lot of people are framing it that way. I think it's a mistake to frame it that way. I think parents have obligations, The real rights here that are engaged here are the rights of the children, but not the right of the children to privacy. No, on the contrary, the right of the children to no privacy in this respect. The right of the children to be guided and raised and parented by their parents. That is a fundamental human right. And what the schools have been doing in this case, if little Jimmy comes at 12 years old and says, "I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. I want you to refer to me as a girl. I want you to refer to me as a she, and I want to be able to use the girls' bathroom in school. Or if we're having gym, I want to be able to use the girls' change rooms in school." And the policy has been in school boards just emerging, because this is all a very new thing, but the policy in school boards has been that we're going to indulge the children because the children, quote unquote, have a right here. And I'm saying, no, 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 no. I mean, this is a new thing that's been happening. This is not 5 years old. It's not 10 years old. It's not 50 years old. It's only in the last year or 2 years that this has really exploded. And I have to tell you, there's a certain amount of social contagion that's involved in here as well. I'll discuss that in a second. But I want to make it perfectly clear that when school officials indulge the children's fantasy in this regard and refuse to notify parents, to consult with parents, to involve parents in this whole thing, they are blocking parents from exercising their obligations, their fundamental human obligation to care for and parent and see that their children are educated, and they are violating the most fundamental aspect of childhood, and that is the right to be parented by their parents. Now, I know what some of you are going to be thinking. If you're opposing where I'm coming from, you might come back and say, well, what about those children who are not with their parents? There are always exceptions, ladies and gentlemen. But whatever the exception is, it does not change the fact that teachers, bureaucrats, do not have the right to stop, to block, to interfere with that relationship between the children and their parents. So I think that that's the better way to frame it. I'm not saying that you're dead wrong and you're damaging the whole argument by framing it elsewise. But I want that to be something that people are aware of and that they're willing to discuss and indeed fight for. Remember that puberty is a difficult, challenging, emotionally distressing time, physically distressing time, physically uncomfortable time for kids as they transition from childhood to adulthood. And it is a responsibility of parents to work with them, to show them patience, to continue to set reasonable boundaries, and to guide them through this most difficult challenge that they have had to face in their lives up until this point in time. It's parents that are responsible here. It's not the teachers. And when they say we're going to keep this from the parents because the children have these rights to privacy, they are denying the children the right to be parented. Simple as that. So this protest today, September the 20th, has been going on across the country in various locations. And there have been some counter protests as well. But the main gist of this is that parents, that families, that just average citizens are coming forward and they're saying, enough. This is enough. Now, when I talk about social contagion, what I mean is this. Kids at 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, they're not, their sex and their gender is not top of the mind. if this has become a large movement, and it has been exploding in our schools amongst younger people, it's because they're hearing about it and reading about it. And that's kids follow kids. All human beings are subject to social contagion, but kids especially. It's a fad. It's a fad, ladies and gentlemen. It's a fad that certain individuals, and I'm not going to imply nefarious intent. I know that that's out there. Some people are saying, they're grooming. I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, I'm willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm not going to accuse anybody of grooming. Whether it's happening or not, I don't know. But I do know this, ladies and gentlemen. I do know that you are confusing children, you are stressing them out, and you are creating a situation here where kids are being robbed of their innocence, and you, and when I say you, I'm talking about the people that are in favor of keeping this kind of thing from parents, who are continuing to promote the gender ideology, who are continuing to talk about it and teach it. You are causing what could end up being irreparable damage to the psychology and the emotional well-being of these children as they grow. And we don't know what the outcome of all of this is going to be, because this is a new thing. There's no research on this that extends, no widespread research on this that extends outwards. Longitudinal is what we call it in the business. So these protests have been going on. They've been going on across the country. And I will say this. I saw a tweet from the mayor of Ottawa today, and my guess is that he's probably not alone in this. And that is, he tweeted out how much, and this was in response, I assume, to the million-person march. He tweeted out that he and Ottawa supports LGBTQ rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a lot more than LGBTQ rights, by the way. I think it was like double the alphabet and symbols and numbers or whatever. Totally off base. Totally not understanding what these marches are all about. And in doing so, in irresponsibly tweeting this, what he's done is he's promoting this conflict, and it's false information. This has nothing to do with gay or not gay, lesbian or not lesbian, or any of that stuff. This has to do with ensuring that parents are allowed to parent their children, which is their obligation. Children are going to be parented by their parents, which is their right. And that we're not confusing them with all of this gender mishigas while they're young and in school. And even more than that, in the final analysis, can we just get back to teaching mathematics, some science, some history, some geography? What is it that the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic? I always thought that was a silly saying, but there I've used it. That's what you go to school for at this level, okay? You don't go to school at this level to discover yourself. You're going to discover yourself. But in the meantime, you need to have the tools to be able to be a productive citizen. You need to be able to read. You need to be able to write. You need to be able to count properly. Maybe learn a little bit of history about the country and some of the geography. Remember, the number one thing that contributes to people being gullible, to people being susceptible to hoodwinking, is ignorance. If you have fundamental basic knowledge, people can't pull the wool over your eyes, or it's very difficult. Ignorance, ladies and gentlemen, is the close ally of con artists, of snake oil salesmen, that kind of thing. So that's what's happening today, right across the country. And I have to tell you, good for the protesters. This is where we have to start drawing some lines here, ladies and gentlemen. So I support the protesters. I certainly don't support violence, but there hasn't been, to my knowledge, any violence here, unless there's been violence on the part of some of the counter protesters who, again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but who from time to time do engage in provocative actions that precipitate violence. So I don't know of any cases of violence in any of the protests across the country, but violent or not, it's perfectly reasonable for these protests to be going on, and I support them, and I'm glad that people are doing it. It's time for people to push back. Let kids be kids, and let parents be parents. Okay, we're going to go for a break. When we come back, let's have a quick update, because there are a few other things we got to get into tonight, but we're going to have a quick update on what's happening at the Freedom Trial here, or what's happened at the Freedom Trial here, Freedom Convoy Trial in Ottawa. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.
Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste, ice cool vanilla for me. Hundreds and thousands, I need an ice cream island. Give me ice cream with whipped cream, strawberry sauce, and see my face gleam. I need a wafer on top, just ice cream full stop. So take me to the pudding shop. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste.
There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might.
And welcome back. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, September the 20th, 2023. As I said before, one day left in official summer, although it has been pleasantly cool here in Canada's national capital. I don't think we even reached 20 degrees today Celsius, which would mean our high was in the 60s, and it's been that way all week long so far. just on the heels of an abnormally cool August, where we actually did set records here in Eastern Ontario for August. We had the lowest maximum temperature for the entire month. We didn't hit 30 degrees. It was something like 28 degrees was the highest temperature we hit in the month of August here in Eastern Ontario. And that's the lowest highest temperature. It's a record. So, if you want to talk about records. Anyway, okay, so we were talking about the million person march, and I want to shift gears a little bit. There are a number of items that I want to get to this evening. But before I get onto some of the other ones, let me first of all say or give you an update on what's going on with the Freedom Convoy trial, day 12 here in Ottawa. The trial continues to drag on. I don't think, given what's going on, that they're going to come anywhere close to meeting their 16-day schedule. So the trial will have to be adjourned and resumed at some point in time. And who knows how long it's going to be. But nothing really new, just maybe some new information. Kim Ayot, the manager of emergency services here in Ottawa at the time of the Freedom Convoy, was testifying again today. And today he talked about negotiations that were going on between leaders of the Freedom Convoy and himself and city officials. And they came to an agreement, apparently, that vehicles, trucks would be moved off of any residential streets that they were on. And the deal was that they would be placed on Wellington Street. Now, Wellington Street is about, let's just say about a half a mile long at the point where they were going to be moved to, which is in front of the Parliament buildings. It's the street. It's sort of like Pennsylvania Avenue as it passes in front of the White House in Washington for my American friends. So that would be Wellington Street, passing in front of the Canadian Parliament buildings. And that was a deal that apparently Mr. Ayot had brokered with some of the organizers, Freedom Convoy organizers that he was in communication with. And the whole idea was, I guess, to reduce the inconvenience that were being experienced by people who live on these residential streets. Okay, all fair and good, all well and good. But then, very strange testimony, okay? First of all, after brokering the deal, other jurisdictions, other organizations with specific jurisdictions in the city of Ottawa raised objections, particularly the Parliamentary Protective Service, which is responsible for providing security on Parliament Hill. And they raised some specific objections, particularly around the possibility of explosions. They had just run an exercise where they had simulated explosive devices. And so the head of the Parliamentary Protective Services apparently emailed back the Mr. Ayot raising objections and basically saying, how could you do this? I'm paraphrasing, of course, but how could you do this when we've just had this exercise? Now, here's the thing about the Parliamentary Protective Services in Ottawa. They have jurisdiction over the parliamentary buildings, the buildings within the parliamentary precinct that are used for offices of members of parliament, but they don't have jurisdiction for policing the streets around those buildings or any of the outdoors around those buildings. That's the Ottawa Police, except, of course, those areas that are patrolled by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It's a dog's breakfast, okay? And this I don't want to bore you with this. I only bring all of this up because it's relevant, I think, to the trial overall, because it's an illustration of how confusing and disorganized the authorities were here. Now, we all know that already anecdotally, but here it is coming out, I think, in testimony. So then Mr. Ayotte, I guess, gives very strange testimony now when he talks about how the Freedom Convoy people were actually not living up to their end of the bargain, because when he went and checked things out, he saw that they were jockeying for position, I think is the word he used, for better positions on Wellington Street. But I don't understand. I thought that that was exactly what the deal was. You wanted them to move off of the residential streets. There were 3 or 4 residential streets where there were trucks parked, and you wanted them to move onto Wellington Street. That was the whole point of the head of the Protective Services, Parliamentary Protective Services, protesting that decision without proper notification. So to me, the whole thing doesn't make sense. And if I'm confused, surely to goodness other leaders of the convoy, of Freedom Convoy, had to be confused as well. And then, of course, all of this was going on at the same time that I guess the police were working what their response was going to be, because all of this was happening about the time or shortly before the protest was broken up. The Emergencies Act was invoked and the protest was broken up. But it does is it's an illustration of how much confusion there was amongst city officials, government officials. And of course, I have to tell you this: I don't blame the head of the Parliamentary Protective Services for having some dire concerns about safety and security on Parliament Hill, and talking about potential explosives in big trucks. Okay, I mean, what do you expect when the Prime Minister and then the news media sort of regurgitating his statements about how these were extremists, etc., even though in reality there was no violence going on, and everybody that was there knew there was no violence, but nevertheless city officials, government officials continued to act as though this was a violent group. They treated them this way. They spread fear amongst the general population, and not just here in Ottawa, but right across the country. Okay, so I'm a broken record when I talk about this, but the testimony today is just one more illustration of how badly organized and how ignorant these guys were of what everybody was doing. The left hand literally did not know what the right hand was doing. Well, not literally, figuratively. Okay, if you want to correct my grammar. But before I move on, let me just make one more observation. You heard it before. Here it is again. What's it got to do with the charges that were laid against these 2 defendants? Nothing. It's got nothing to do. When do we have testimony about how these 2 defendants broke the law as they have been accused of breaking the law? So far, it's the city of Ottawa that's on trial. So far, it's officials that are on trial. Really, when you get down to it, I really hope that the judge is seeing this. I really hope that the judge is going to really come back, not just with a verdict of not guilty, but a verdict of not guilty with extreme prejudice. I really hope that that's the case. I'm not banking on it or anything, but I certainly do hope that's the case. Okay, talking about governments and government overreach and incompetence, here in Canada, our privacy commissioner just released a finding that Canada Post has been breaking the law by gathering information from envelopes, from parcels, etc., that are being delivered to you by their employees. So in other words, this is what's happening. If I order something from, let's say, Amazon, and it's delivered to me through Canada Post, or if I order anything online, and it's delivered to me through Canada Post. Somebody, somehow, whether I don't think it's the guy actually delivering the mail, but it's somewhere in the delivery chain, my address, my name has been recorded and cross-referenced with whoever is delivering, providing the goods or services that I've purchased that have to be delivered through the mail. And that's been put in a database, and Canada Post has been renting that data to marketing companies in order for marketing companies to know who to target for various things. And, when you think about it, okay, from a purely marketing point of view, I know that this kind of thing is done. Yeah, this is why when you're on Google and you search something out, and then before you know it, the ads for the same type of thing are showing up all over the place on when you're surfing the internet. Big tech does it. And I don't particularly care for big tech doing this, but they've been doing it, okay. And there are ways that you can block it and opt out, etc., etc. But who knew that Canada Post, a crown corporation, an arm of our government, would be doing this and then selling that information, ladies and gentlemen? Who would have thought that? Is that really what our government has come to? It's unbelievable. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see what happens from it. I'm wondering whether or not anybody's going to actually lose their jobs. But it's a frustrating thing, and it is a thing. I don't want you to dismiss that. It sounds like it's so small and minor, but really, when you think about it, what other kinds of information are passive information about ourselves, our tastes, what we buy, what we eat? How much of that data is being collected by different people altogether, by governments? I don't know. I mean, that just doesn't sit well with me. And when we come back, okay, we're going to go for a break, but when we come back on a related topic, the United Kingdom has just passed into law its internet safety bill. And you're going to want to know a little bit about that, because I can promise you there's one in the works here in Canada. It'll be coming down soon. So stick with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And welcome back. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Wednesday, September the 20th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for sticking with us. All right, the United Kingdom, and for those of you who don't know, the United Kingdom is sometimes colloquially referred to as England. Of course, it's the United Kingdom is not just England, it's the United Kingdom is actually the union of Scotland and England. And then you can include Wales and Northern Ireland in that as well. But the UK, ladies and gentlemen, has just passed a law. And it is its internet safety law, its online safety law. And they are giving themselves pats on the back. They are talking about how this makes, quote, the UK the safest place to be online in the world, end quote. I'm always uncomfortable when I'm advising political figures, government officials. I usually tell them, just tone the statement down. Don't get yourself in a position where the minute there's a glitch that people can point to you and say, "Oh, you see, you deceived us. You were wrong. You exaggerated." Blah blah blah. I don't know that this makes the UK the safest place to be online. I don't even know, quite frankly, what that means, being the safest place online, but that's what they're talking about. So, what exactly does this bill do? Well, it requires internet providers, social media, particularly social media platforms like Twitter or X or whatever they're calling themselves today, Facebook or Meta, whatever they're calling themselves today, Instagram, TikTok, etc., etc. It will require these platforms to police the content that is being posted. Hateful content has to be removed. Other things along those lines, ladies and gentlemen. So, what is the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is, do you want the government to define what is hate speech? Because I think that that's a very controversial term to start with. And I think that the idea of what is and is not hate speech is controversial as well. Now, I'm not comfortable entirely with framing this whole thing as a freedom of speech thing, because unlike most people in the conservative movement, or self-proclaimed conservatives within the conservative movement, I consider myself to be a genuine conservative. I don't believe in absolute rights. Okay, I think that all rights have to be um, uh, they have to be actualized within a certain context. So I don't believe in absolute black and white, unrestricted freedom of speech. But on the other hand, I'm not comfortable with the government, with elected officials, determining what is and is not freedom, or what is or is not hate speech. I'm not comfortable with that either. It could be that a government can look at something and say that's hate speech, and I would agree with them. And I probably would agree that, we don't want any of that on the internet. But understand that once you give the government the power to do that, you're giving the power to them to curtail freedom of speech when it doesn't meet any kind of a reasonable standard of hate speech. So, what is and is not hate speech? Well, there are types of things that we can all agree is hate speech. There are lots of things, most things that we all agree are not hate speech, but there are things in the middle, things that are going to be controversially labeled as hate speech. And, it's apropos to have this discussion now because, in light of what we were talking about earlier in the show with this million-person march, is it hate speech for parents to say, I do not agree that the schools should be preventing me from knowing that my child is taking a position that he or she wants to transition to a different gender. My 10-year-old, my 11-year-old, my 12-year-old child wants to use different pronouns. Now, it's very easy to say, when you're looking at that statement and that position, to say, well, I may not agree with it, but it's not an unreasonable statement to make. It's not an unreasonable position to take. Therefore, I don't agree that that would constitute hate speech. I think that most people would agree with that, including people who are on the other side of the question from where I am. But that doesn't matter, because there are people in government, and I'll point to the example of the mayor of Ottawa, who tweeted out today again, his support for LGBTQ rights, etc. The framing of it, and in many cases, the ignorant framing of it, contributes to people thinking that it's hate speech, A, or B, there are people out there that are going to say it is hate speech. And if they have control of the government, even though to all reasonable people it's not hate speech, they're going to use the government to shut it down. Now, let's take a very extreme example and ask ourselves this, okay? Consider National Socialist Germany. Do you think everybody wants to, the obvious question here is going to be, well, when the Germans were publishing material that was hateful directed at Jews, that was clearly hate speech. Okay, we all agree on that. But what if, ladies and gentlemen, the speech that was being attacked were Christian groups, and there were some Christian groups who were arguing that the movement against Jews, actions taken against Jews, speech that was leveled against Jews, that they were in opposition to it. And they were saying, you can't do that. Jews are good people. Jews are not evil. Would you want the government in Berlin, the National Socialist government, the Nazis, do you think that if they had an internet at that time that they wouldn't move to block that kind of speech? Stuff that is obviously, to those of us who are reasonable, not hate speech. It's the opposite. But it's the government that gets to determine what it is. And I know I'm using an extreme example, but I don't think that it is inconceivable. I don't think that it's implausible that a government like Hitler's government, if the circumstances dictated it, would have been hesitated to label this hate speech. Not the anti-Jewish stuff, the pro-Jewish speech, the small number of people who were courageous enough to speak out against the regime and what they were doing. Why wouldn't the government of Nazi Germany label that hate speech? And then invoke whatever legislation that they had in place in order to prevent it from being disseminated. See, this is the danger. The danger is that there are things that we can all agree on ought not to be broadcast around. And there are all kinds of things that we would agree should and can be broadcast without any problem. But what about those things that are controversial? Or what about somebody or a group of people gaining political power and then using not just the legislation, but the apparatus that's been created to enforce the legislation, to enforce the opposite? See, that's the problem. That's the practical problem. So, is there a solution to this? Well, the default solution to this is that we should allow free speech. That's the default position. The government should not be empowered. It should not be responsible. It should not be given the obligation or the right to tell people what is and is not acceptable speech. That's the default position. But that raises a whole different issue altogether. And the issue it raises is, what about the stuff that really is hate speech? If we're saying that the government doesn't have the right and shouldn't have the power to block stuff that is absolutely, obviously, to everybody, hate speech, if we're not going to give the government that right, if we're not going to give the government that power, then how do we stop that from happening? Well, my friends, it's a dilemma. And it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma that no other than Edmund Burke himself touched on. When he pointed out, when we talking about tradition, talking about traditional values, when Edmund Burke pointed out that all people, human beings by their very nature require government. And they either govern themselves according to a set of moral laws that are more or less accepted as being objective, or the government has to step in and govern over them. So, where I'm going with this, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The reason that we have to have, the reason we're even having this debate, and again, I'm not saying I support what the UK government is doing. I actually am one of those people that regrettably, and I say regrettably, comes down on the freedom of speech side on this. But the very reason that the government is doing this in the UK and that our government here in Canada is going to do the same thing, mark my words, is because people themselves are not governing themselves. They are not stopping themselves. We have abandoned in our society any sense of decency, any sense of responsibility to stop ourselves from acting in an immoral way, to stop ourselves from punishing other people because of the color of their skin, their race, their religion. These are things that ought not to have to be enforced by government. And if we are not going to govern ourselves, then, as Edmund Burke pointed out, you're going to have the government, the state, stepping in and doing it. So all of these things, ladies and gentlemen, are a reflection of the deterioration of our society. And all that's happening is that the government is stepping in order to try to stop what's happening. And I don't think they can do it successfully. We must go back to being able to govern ourselves. And yes, you can have laws on the books, yes. But the key here is self-government. And self-government doesn't just mean we get to do elections and choose who our elected representatives are. That's not really what self-government is. Self-government really is about you and I ruling over our own passions, our own predilections, controlling our behavior, being upright, decent, honest individuals, human beings. And if we were all like this, we wouldn't have to have this debate about what government powers should be, because it wouldn't be a problem. So for all of you people out there that are in favor of free speech, you need to also say free speech means responsible speech. And I don't mean that in the legal term. I don't mean that in the legal sense at all. I mean responsible speech, responsible behavior, decent, mature behavior, moral behavior. Because if you don't have that, then you will not have freedom of speech. If you cannot have a society governing itself, if you do not have a society governing its own behavior, then you cannot have freedom of speech. Not because we don't want it, but because it won't exist. Time for our final break of the evening, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben Show. Don't go away. And we are back. Thank you so much for joining. Well, staying with us, I should say, not joining. You were already here. You're tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show, and I am your host, Joseph Benamy. Okie doke, what are we going to do now? Well, we're in the home stretch, so you know what that means. This day in history. Okay, well, let's see. There are lots of things. Oh, there are always lots of things going on. This day in the year 1519, Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan departed from, oh dear, I can't even pronounce the name, from his a port in Spain, let's put it that way, on a journey to circumnavigate the globe. Now, this is something that you haven't heard anywhere else. Everybody knows, oh, Magellan, first person to go around the globe. Actually, not. Ferdinand Magellan died during the voyage. The expedition itself actually did succeed. It did circumnavigate the globe, but Magellan was not there for the conclusion. He died on the voyage. Also, on this day in 1792, the French Legislative Assembly was replaced by the National Convention, marking the formal beginning of what became known as the First French Republic. Now, that was just the First French Republic. We are now on the Fifth French Republic. So, that, I'm not sure what that means, but there it is. 1973, on this day in 1973, the Battle of the Sexes between tennis player Billie Jean King and tennis player Bobby Riggs. Billie Jean King being female, Bobby Riggs being a male. 1973, the winner of that was Billie Jean King. I remember it was big news at the time. Very interesting. Very interesting. 2017, Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, causing more than $90 billion in damages. And according to government officials, it also caused nearly 3,000 deaths. And finally, going back again into the year 1870, the city of Rome was incorporated into the country of Italy. I know that sounds strange, but Rome was kind of like its own independent city-state. Well, on this day in 1870, Italian troops entered and occupied Rome, which led to the eventual incorporation of Rome into the Kingdom of Italy. The papal government, that is to say the Pope, the Vatican, is in Rome and continues to have the status of an independent country. All right. So those are a few things that happened on this day in history on September 20th, September 20th period. I was going to say 2023. That would be a silly thing for me to say, wouldn't it? All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, coming to the end of another, like I say, frenetic hour-long show. So as always, my friends, you can check out the website. The website is www.josephbenamy.com. There it is, showing up on the bottom of our video. If you're not watching the video, but you're listening to the podcast, I'll say it again, www.josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. And also, while you're at it, ladies and gentlemen, you can also follow me on Twitter, at Joseph Benamy. That's it. That's my Twitter handle, at Joseph Benamy. Okay, well, just looking at the clock here, we're going to have to wrap things up for the evening, ladies and gentlemen. So I appreciate you, as always, tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends and neighbors about the Joseph Benamy Show. If you're catching us on YouTube or Rumble, subscribe. Doesn't cost you anything, and you will be notified when there are new shows coming up. And it always helps to increase our traffic. And that's about it. So we will catch you then tomorrow night here on the Joseph Benamy Show. Until then, God bless. Look after yourselves and your families, and especially your children. And whatever you do, do not drink, ladies and gentlemen, the Kool-Aid.